Hey, it's Tom from Texas, and it's time for another Floppy deep dive. And today we're going to be doing another episode in the series of Commodore versus the NES. Yep. So we're going to be looking at games that start with the letters E through G in this episode. So let me give you a little bit of history. I grew up a Commodore 64 kid. I loved everything about the Commodore, everything that it could do for me. Getting free games off of BBSs, it was great. And I never thought I needed an NES system. I had all these games, but I never knew what I was missing with the NES. After the Commodore for gaming, I went on to the Sega Genesis. So I skipped the NES 100%, didn't play any of these. And a lot of times I'm playing these games for the first time. So I love doing these comparisons. So it's not really me battling NES versus the Commodore. It's me experiencing, what did I miss out? Did I have the game that was better with the Commodore, or did I miss out with all the cool games that were on the NES? Well, this is my time to make it up. So if you like nostalgia, you like to see these games, and maybe you missed out on the NES games too, well, let's go ahead. Let's dive in. So go ahead, pull up a chair, grab a joystick, and let's get started. Boom. Elevator action, an arcade classic where spies, elevators, and non-stop action collide. But how did this game fare when it was brought to the Commodore 64 and the NES? Released in July of 1983, elevator action quickly became a beloved arcade hit. Players controlled a secret agent infiltrating a building filled with enemy spies. The goal is to collect secret documents while navigating a maze of elevators and escalators. But enough about the arcade. Let's dive into how this game transitioned to the home consoles we all know and love. Let's start with the Commodore 64 version, released in 1985 by Data East. Initially, I had some strong reservations about this port. But after re-watching my gameplay, it's not as bad as I remembered. The game does have its flaws. There's still some glitches and the graphics aren't great, but it has a redeeming qualities. The music, for instance, is quite catchy and adds to the experience. And in fact, I think the music on the Commodore 64 is better than the NES version. One thing that stood out to me this time around is how the bad guys in the C64 version remind me of a little French sidekick of Inspector Clouseau from the Pink Panther series. That added a bit of quirky charm to the game. While the C64 version isn't perfect and the gameplay can still feel a bit rough around the edges, it has a certain nostalgic appeal that I didn't fully appreciate before. Now, onto the NES version, released in 1985 in Japan and 87 in North America. The NES port remains impressive, closely mirroring the arcade experience from the very beginning, while the smooth gameplay and visuals that capture the original spirit. The action's fast-paced and the controls are responsive, making it a joy to play. However, the music on the NES doesn't quite hit the same notes as the C64. It's good, but it lacks the charm and catchiness of the C64 soundtrack. And the NES version of elevator action still stands out as the superior port when it comes to gameplay and overall polish. It's incredibly fun, with gameplay that feels just as engaging as it did in the arcade. While the C64 version has its moments, especially with the music and those amusing bad guys, the NES version simply delivers a more polished and satisfying experience. However, I had to give credit to the C64 for its superior music, which adds a unique flavor to the game. That said, I would still pick the NES version for its overall play. From elevators to Space Invaders, let's move on to another classic, Galaxian, and see how the C64 and NES ports of this arcade legend stacks up against each other. Galaxian, a pioneer in space shooter genre that set the stage for countless games to follow. But how did the classic fare when ported to the Commodore 64 and the NES? Galaxian quickly became a staple in the arcade with its simple yet addictive gameplay. Players controlled a lone spaceship battling waves of alien invaders, and the game was known for its vibrant colors and engaging action. But enough about the arcade. Let's see how Galaxian was adapted for the home consoles and computers we all know and love. The Commodore 64 version, released in 1983 by AtariSoft, unfortunately struggles to capture the arcade's charm. The spaceship design appears squished and fat, losing the sleek look that made it iconic. Additionally, the sound effects, particularly the firing of the bullets, come off as weak and lack the punch needed for the intense space shooter. The gameplay remains intact, but the overall experience feels a bit underwhelming. On the other hand, the NES version, released in 1984 by Namco, stays much truer to the original. The spaceship design closely mirrors the arcade, and the graphics, though larger than those in the arcade, are enhanced and vibrant, adding to the visual appeal. The sound effects are much stronger on the NES, bringing more intensity and energy to the gameplay. It's a more faithful and satisfying adaptation. When comparing the two, the NES version clearly stands out for me. The graphics are closer to the arcade, the sounds are more impactful, and the overall gameplay feels more polished and engaging. And the Commodore 64 version, with its squish ship design and its weak audio, just doesn't deliver the same experience. For Galaxian, the NES version is the one I'd choose every time. The NES version wins this round with its faithful adaptation of the arcade experience. The C64 version, while playable, misses the mark in key areas, making the NES the better choice for reliving the classic space shooter action. Now, from battling waves of alien invaders to navigating the depths of space, let's move on to another iconic shooter, Gradius, and see how the C64 and the NES ports of this classic stack up against each other. Gradius, a revolutionary space shooter that introduced the world to power-ups and intense side-scrolling action. This game redefined the genre, but how did it translate to the home systems of the time? First, appearing in the arcades in 1985, Gradius quickly became known for its innovative gameplay and challenging levels. Players guided the Vic Viper through space, battling waves of enemies with a customizable arsenal. But let's move on from the arcade and focus on how this game was brought to our home screens. The Commodore 64 version, released in 1986, unfortunately doesn't quite hit the mark. The music, a crucial part of the arcade and NES experience, is absent, leaving the game feeling a bit hollow. The ship's design on the C64 also diverges from the arcade and the NES, bearing more a resemblance to the ship from Iridium, a comparison that doesn't work in its favor. The difficulty is ramped up considerably, making it a frustrating experience where I find myself dying repeatedly. Overall, it's a lackluster port that fails to capture what made Gradius great. Meanwhile, the NES version, also released in 1986, excels where the Commodore 64 version falls short. The graphics are sharp and vibrant, most outshining the arcade original. The music and the sound effects are intact, adding to the excitement as you blast through enemies. The controls are responsive, making the ship easy to maneuver through the intense levels. The version nails the balance between challenge and enjoyment, making it a standout port. Comparing these two, the NES version is the clear winner. It retains the essence of what made Gradius so engaging, with top-notch controls, great visuals, and the iconic soundtrack that's missing from the Commodore 64. And the NES port of Gradius emerged victorious, delivering a faithful and enjoyable experience that stands the test of time. The C64 version, despite its best efforts, falls short, making the NES the go-to choice for fans of this classic. And now that we've tackled the stars with Gradius, let's dive into another intergalactic battle, Gyruss, and see how these home ports stack up. Gyruss, a classic space shooter with a unique circular movement mechanic that stood out in the arcade scene. The game's been a favorite for many, but how did this translate to the home consoles and computers of the time? First, released in arcades in 1983, Gyruss quickly caught the attention of players with its innovative blend of space shooting and 3D-like circular movement, and the game, often compared to Galaga for its fast-paced action, had players navigating their ships around the screen, shooting down waves of enemies as they approach. But how does this experience make the jump to the Commodore 64 and the NES? The Commodore 64 version, released in 1984, captures the essence of the arcade game. The circular movement is executed perfectly, making the game feel just as dynamic and engaging as its arcade counterpart. And the sound on the Commodore 64 is nothing short of incredible, pushing the SID chip to its limits and delivering a soundtrack that rivals the arcade version. The controls are tight and responsive, allowing for smooth and precise navigation, and this version feels like a true arcade experience brought home, with no major sacrifices in gameplay or sound. Now, the NES version was released in 1988, and it takes a slightly different approach. The graphics are enhanced with bigger ships and more detailed visuals that give the game a fresh, updated look. However, these changes also give the game a different feel, and while the NES version is polished and technically impressive, it feels more like Gyruss 2.0 rather than a direct port of the arcade original. The sound and music, while good, doesn't quite reach the same level as the Commodore 64 iconic soundtrack, and the controls are solid, but the overall experience feels like a reimagining rather than a faithful reproduction of the arcade. So after comparing both versions, I have to say the Commodore 64 wins this one. It stays true to the original arcade experience, with excellent controls, incredible sound, and an authentic circular movement that made the arcade game so much fun. The NES version is impressive in its own right, almost like a sequel with bigger graphics and a more modern feel, but it doesn't capture the spirit of the arcade game in the same way. For me, the C64 is the one that really brings Gyruss home. And in this battle, the Commodore 64 comes out on top, delivering a near-perfect port that stays faithful to the arcade original. The NES version, while excellent, takes some liberties that makes it feel like a different game altogether. If you're looking for a classic Gyruss experience, the C64 is the way to go. And with Gyruss behind us, let's move on to the next game, Gauntlet, a dungeon crawler that brought cooperative gameplay to a new level. How does the Commodore 64 and NES versions compare? Let's find out. Gauntlet, released in 1985, Gauntlet was a game changer in the arcades, allowing up to 4 players to hack and slash their way through endless dungeons filled with monsters, treasures, and traps. And the game's fast-paced action and unique cooperative gameplay made it an instant hit, but let's see how this dungeon crawler was adapted for home play. The Commodore 64 version, released in 1987, does a solid job of capturing the core elements of Gauntlet. The controls are smooth and responsive, allowing you to maneuver the character and fire at monsters with ease. However, the graphics, while decent, don't quite match the detail found in the arcade version. One notable absence is the music. Just like the arcade, the Commodore 64 version sticks to the original silence. Focusing on the atmospheric sound effects, it's a faithful rendition, but it lacks the visual polish and the audio flair that some might hope for. Now, the NES version, released also in 1987, takes a slightly different approach. As a dedicated game console, the NES brings its enhanced graphics that are much closer to the arcades, with sharper detail and more vibrant colors. The controls remain excellent, ensuring the fast-paced action feels just as responsive as it should. One major addition is the music, which, while not part of the original arcade experience, adds an extra layer of excitement to the gameplay. However, it's important to note that the speech from the arcade, like "the wizard is about to die," is missing both in the NES and the C64 version, which is a bit of a letdown. Still, the NES version stands out for its visual and auditory enhancements, making it the superior version for home play. In comparing the two, I have to give the edge to the NES version. The Commodore 64 holds its own with solid controls and faithful gameplay, but the NES version offers better graphics and the addition of music, which, though not arcade authentic, enhances the overall experience. The NES just feels more polished, bringing a bit more excitement to the dungeon crawling adventure. The C64 is a great option, especially for those who appreciate a more true to arcade experience, but for my money, the NES wins this round. And now, with our dungeon crawling adventure behind us, let's jump into the punishing world of Ghosts and Goblins, a platformer that has tested the patience of gamers for decades. How do the C64 and NES versions compare? Let's take a look. Ghosts and Goblins, a game known for its challenging gameplay and relentless difficulty. This platform has tested the patience of gamers for decades, but how well did it translate from the arcade to the Commodore 64 and the NES? Released in 1985, Ghosts and Goblins became notorious for its punishing difficulty, but that didn't stop it from becoming a beloved classic. The game's mix of platforming, enemies popping out of nowhere, and that infamous two-hit system made it a staple in arcades everywhere. But let's see how this experience was brought to our home systems. The Commodore 64 version, released in 1986, does a commendable job of bringing the arcade experience home. The controls are tight, the sounds are excellent, and the gameplay is just as challenging as you expected. However, the C64 does suffer from some sprite flashing issues. Where there's too much action on the screen, the sprites tend to flicker, which can be a bit distracting and take away from the experience. It's unfortunately because the game itself is otherwise great. Whether you're playing on an original floppy or a cracked version, the sprite issue is just part of the package. And the NES version, also released in 1986, is where the game really shines. The graphics are polished, avoiding that sprite flashing issue seen on the C64. And the sounds are top-notch, and the gameplay is just as frustrating fun as the arcade. As a dedicated gaming console, the NES was designed to handle games like this, and it shows. The overall experience feels more refined with smooth animations and a more consistent visual presentation. It's everything you'd want from a home version of Ghosts and Goblins. And I've got a soft spot for the C64 version. It's the one I played growing up, and they did an amazing job with it. But if I'm being honest, the NES version takes the crown here. The graphics are cleaner, the gameplay feels more polished, and there's just something about the NES's ability to handle everything smoothly that makes it a better choice. The C64 version is still a great game, and for those who love the Commodore like me, it's definitely worth playing, but the NES version just does it better. So from battling demons and ghouls, let's switch gears to a different kind of adventure, Ghostbusters. How do these two home versions stack up against each other? Let's find out. Ghostbusters, a beloved franchise that made its way into the gaming world with high expectations. But how did it fare when it was brought to the Commodore 64 and NES? Let's find out. Ghostbusters wasn't just a movie phenomenon, it was a hit in the gaming world, but how well did ghost-busting action translate to our home systems? First, let's look at the Commodore 64 version of Ghostbusters, released in 1984. It was nothing short of amazing. The game captured the essence of the movie with spot-on gameplay, great graphics, and even speech, a rare treat for games at that time. And the controls are smooth, making ghost catching fun as it should be. And whether you're driving around the city, trapping ghosts, or managing ghost-busting business, the Commodore 64 version nails it. The Ghostbusters themselves look just like the movie counterparts, adding to the overall experience. The driving sequences where you suck up the ghost as you go, it's a highlight. It keeps the action engaging and true to the spirit of the film. Now, on the other hand, the NES version, released in 1988, is a major disappointment. The gameplay feels sluggish and uninspired, especially during the driving segments. Instead of fast-paced ghost-catching action, you're stuck dealing with mundane tasks like running out of gas and pushing the car, which just drags down the pace of the game. And the graphics are another letdown. The Ghostbusters look like they're army men in uniforms than an iconic characters that we know and love. It's a confusing choice that takes away from the experience. And overall, the NES version is a pale imitation, lacking the charm and fun of the Commodore 64 version. So when it comes to Ghostbusters, the Commodore 64 blows the NES out of the water. The C64 version is faithful and a fun adaptation with great gameplay, excellent speech, and graphics that truly capture the essence of the Ghostbusters. The NES version, by contrast, feels like a poor attempt at cashing in on the franchise, with boring gameplay and visuals that just don't do the Ghostbusters justice. It's probably one of the worst NES games I ever played, and that's saying something. So, now that we've tackled the world of Ghostbusters, let's switch gears to a different kind of challenge. F-15 Strike Eagle, a legendary flight simulator from Microprose that gave players a chance to pilot one of the most advanced fighter jets of all time. But how did this experience translate to the Commodore 64 and the NES? Let's find out. Now, F-15 Strike Eagle was known for its intense mission-based gameplay that combined simulation with action. But how did this complex experience adapt to the home system? The Commodore 64 version, released in 1984, is a true classic. Developed by Microprose, this version stands out for its incredible attention to detail in simulating the experience of flying an F-15. The missions are diverse and engaging, while level of depth was groundbreaking for the time. The controls are complex but rewarding, giving players a true sense of being in the cockpit, and the C64 handles the simulation aspect perfectly, making it a must-play for fans of flight sims. Now, the NES version was released in 1991. They took a different approach. Instead, sticking with the deep simulation roots, it turned into more of an arcade-style game. While this makes it more accessible to a broader audience, it loses some of the complexity and realism that made the Commodore 64 version so special. The gameplay is faster paced, but it doesn't capture the same level of immersion. It feels more like a simplified action game rather than a true flight simulator. And for me, the Commodore 64 takes this round. The C64 version stays true to the spirit of the original, offering a detailed and challenging simulation that holds up even today. Now, the NES version, while not bad, just doesn't deliver the same experience. It's more arcade-like, which might appeal to some, but for fans of flight sims, the C64 is a clear winner. And in the battle of F-15 Strike Eagle, the Commodore 64 emerges as the superior version, delivering a rich and authentic flight simulation experience. The NES version, while offering a different take, can't match the depth and realism of Microprose brought to the C64. And with the F-15 Strike Eagle behind us, we have now compared some of the best and worst of these two systems have to offer. And there you have it, folks. We've taken a deep dive into some of the most iconic games from the Commodore 64 and the NES, comparing their strengths and seeing how they stack up against each other. It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. From elevator action to Ghosts and Goblins, each game brought its own unique flavor and memories, whether it was nostalgic simplicity of the Commodore 64 or the advanced capabilities of the NES. Both systems have their special place in gaming history. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more retro gaming content. And if you feel extra generous and want to support the channel, check out my Patreon page. Your support helps me keep making these videos and exploring the world of retro gaming. Also, if you haven't seen the previous episodes of the Commodore 64 vs. NES, make sure you check them out. We've covered some fantastic games and you won't want to miss them. Thank you so much for watching and all of your support. I love hearing your stories and experience with these classic games, so feel free to leave a comment below and share your thoughts. And until next time, keep those retro vibes alive, and I'll see you in the next video. Boom.